Of all the prehistoric megafauna who thrived during the Pleistocene, the woolly mammoth is the undisputed symbol of the Ice Age. However, it is one of many species of prehistoric elephants, or proboscideans, that ancient humans encountered many thousands of years ago, and in this video, we'll look at the diversity of late Pleistocene proboscideans. We're of course going to start with the iconic woolly mammoth. This species thrived across much of the northerly latitudes over the course of the Ice Ages. The habitat which they are ideally suited to is known as mammoth steppe. Modern grasslands are usually found between 50 and 30 degrees north and south, and are characterized by alternating wet and dry seasons. This means that throughout much of the year, plant growth is limited by the availability of water. Above 50 degrees north, we find boreal forests, which are characterized by the abundance of pine trees, and above the Arctic Circle, there we find tundra, with many species of mosses and herbaceous plants. Plant growth in tundras and boreal forests is usually limited by the availability of nutrients versus water. During the Ice Ages, mammoth steppe covered most of the areas covered by boreal forests today. Mammoth steppe had a similar temperature regime to boreal forests and tundras, while having a similar precipitation regime to modern grasslands. This meant they were also water limited and were dominated by low-growing grasses, although sedges were also abundant. While nowhere near as common as it was during the Pleistocene, mammoth steppe can still be found in southern Siberia, just north of where the borders of China, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Mongolia meet. Woolly mammoths had a number of adaptations which allowed them to thrive in this environment, most notably their insulative properties. Woolly mammoths are named for their coats, which were double-layered. The outer layer of coarse hairs were up to a meter long and shielded them from the harsh winds of the open steppe, and an inner wool-like layer helped them retain heat. Below this, woolly mammoths had a thick layer of insulating fatty tissue, along with small ears to minimize heat loss, the opposite effect of the large ears of the African elephants, which act as radiators. Apart from adaptations to cope with the cold, woolly mammoths had evolved to take advantage of the food available on the steppe. Grass has a high silica content, and as a result can be quite abrasive. To cope with this, woolly mammoths had up to 28 ridges or lamellae on their molars, making them expert grazers. Woolly mammoths died out across most of the northern continents 10,000 years ago, but survived on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea until 5,600 years ago, and on Wrangel Island until 3,600 years ago. Yes, mammoths were still alive when the pyramids were being built. However, the woolly mammoths on Wrangel Island were smaller than those on the mainland, at between 1.8 and 2.3 meters at the shoulder. And this brings me to a common misconception or disappointment about woolly mammoths. They were about the size as a modern African elephant. Males were on average a little over 3 meters at the shoulder and weighed in at around 6 tons, while many people think they were absolutely enormous when compared to modern elephants. But before you get too bummed out about this, the woolly mammoth was not the only species of mammoth that ancient humans encountered. In North America, there was the Columbian mammoth, or Mammuthus columbii, and unlike the woolies, the Columbian mammoth was roughly twice the size of the African elephant. Males were 4 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed in at 12 tons. The Columbian mammoth inhabited the continental United States except for the Northeast and the Great Lakes region, and the portion of Mexico north of Mexico City. Oftentimes, the Columbian mammoth is depicted without fur, much like a modern elephant, but no preserved skin from it has yet been found. We have found hair that definitely came from some kind of elephant in Castroville, California. Since it's too far south to have come from a woolly mammoth, it had to have come from a Columbian. This tuft of fur was yellowish-brown in color, like that of a golden retriever. Of course, modern elephants have some hair, such as the bit at the end of their tail, so the discovery of a tuft of Columbian mammoth fur really doesn't tell us much about the distribution of hair over their body. In my opinion, many reconstructions of the Columbian mammoth are mostly hairless, because the author wants the viewer to know that while it's a mammoth, which one can tell by the spiraling tusks, it's not a woolly mammoth. But, while easy to digest, is this realistic? Well, even though Columbian mammoths wouldn't have had to deal with Arctic conditions like their woolly cousins, they still would have been exposed to freezing temperatures on a regular basis over much of their range. So, if I were to guess, they were completely covered in fur which was a few centimeters long, versus the 1 meter strands on woolly mammoths. For all intensive purposes, Columbian mammoths would have looked like giant woolly mammoths with buzz cuts. In another contrast with woolly mammoths, Columbians only had between 18 and 20 ridges on their molars. This suggests that while they were primarily grazers, Columbian mammoths weren't as specialized for it as the woolly mammoth, and would occasionally engage in browsing. One of their favorite foods to pick off trees was the Osage orange, and when the mammoths defecated, they released the seeds along with a lot of fertilizer. The mammoths were among the only animals large enough to pick and eat the oranges, so the plant largely depended on the mammoths for seed dispersal. After the mammoths went extinct, the Osage orange went into decline, and while they survived to the present day, the tree is nowhere near as abundant as it was during the Pleistocene. The range of the woolly and Columbian mammoths overlapped over much of the northern continental United States, where they would have occasionally hybridized. A specimen known as the Jefferson's mammoth, initially believed to be a distinct species, is now believed to have been a woolly Columbian mammoth hybrid. Further south in California, some Columbian mammoths swam to and settled on the Channel Islands 80,000 years ago. Here, they underwent island dwarfism to become the pygmy mammoth, or Mammothus exilis. This species stood between 1.7 and 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed between 760 and 1,350 kilos. The pygmy mammoths died out 13,000 years ago, and island dwarfism will be a recurring theme throughout this video. Columbian mammoths themselves seem to have died out by 11,000 years ago, at the onset of the Younger Dryas, a cold snap at the very end of the Pleistocene. Some specimens have been dated to a few hundred years later, but the dates on these couldn't be accurately calibrated. The next species of mammoth we'll look at is the steppe mammoth, or Mammuthus troghantherii. As big as the Columbian mammoth was, the steppe mammoth was on average 20% more massive, with larger males being 4.5 meters at the shoulder and weighing in at 14.4 tons, making it the largest of the mammoths. Like the Columbian mammoth, the steppe mammoth had between 18 and 20 ridges on its molars, implying it was primarily, but not exclusively, a grazer. The steppe mammoth evolved from the southern mammoth in East Asia 1.7 million years ago in the early Pleistocene. Throughout much of the Pleistocene, it ranged across most of Eurasia, except the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. Shortly after it arrived in Europe, a population was stranded on Crete, where they again underwent island dwarfism. The Cretan mammoth, or Mammuthus creticus, is only known from fragmentary remains, which indicated it was around 1 meter high at the shoulder and weighed between 180 and 310 kilos. The Cretan mammoth appears to have died out in the mid-Pleistocene, but another population of steppe mammoths landed on the island of Sardinia 450,000 years ago. Here, they again underwent island dwarfism and became the Sardinian mammoth, or Mammuthus larmormori. This species was a bit larger than the Cretan cousins at 1.4 meters at the shoulder, with a weight between 420 and 1,650 kilos. We can't really say for sure whether or not modern humans encountered Sardinian mammoths. The oldest human remains in Sardinia date to 20,000 years ago, but Homo sapiens were in Europe by 40,000 years ago. So, it may be possible that humans reached Sardinia by boat 40,000 years ago, but we have no direct evidence of human-Sardinian mammoth cohabitation. Some steppe mammoths crossed the Bering Land Bridge 1.5 million years ago, where they gave rise to the Columbian mammoth, and 400,000 years ago, a Siberian population evolved into the woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoths also crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America 100,000 years ago, where they would meet their long-lost Columbian cousins. So, mammoths made this journey twice. By 200,000 years ago, the steppe mammoth was replaced over much of their range in Eurasia by woolly mammoths. While they would have certainly encountered other human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans, it's hard to say for sure if steppe mammoths encountered Homo sapiens, because they would have died out by the time modern humans arrived in their ranges. It is a possibility that the two interacted in two ways. First, fragmentary remains believed to have come from the steppe mammoth were found in northern China and Mongolia and have been dated to between 33 and 35,000 years ago. The oldest human remains found in this region date from this time, so if the aforementioned remains turn out to be that of a steppe mammoth, it would mean that some populations lasted long enough to encounter modern humans. The other way has to do with classification. A morphological analysis of mammoth molars indicated that the Columbian mammoth fell within the range of variation seen in the steppe mammoth, and, as such, should be considered a North American population of it versus a separate species. We have ample evidence of not only Paleo-Indians living in the same time and locations as the Columbian mammoth, but interactions between the two, such as spear tips and mammoth bones. So, if the analysis is indeed accurate, it would mean that the steppe mammoth had lived long enough to encounter modern humans in North America as the Columbian mammoth. While mammoths are arguably the most famous Ice Age elephants, the mastodon comes in at a solid second place. While they were once a diverse clade which ranged across the northern hemisphere, by the late Pleistocene, only the American mastodon, or Mammut americanum, still lived. As its name suggests, it was endemic to North America, and it shared most of its range with the Columbian mammoth. If we were to make a family tree of the living proboscideans, we'll see two main branches, that being the Asian elephant and African elephants. The mammoths were more closely related to the Asian elephants, while mastodons branched off from living elephants before their common ancestor lived. The common ancestor of mammoths, living elephants, and mastodons lived about 20 million years ago. We have found herds of mastodons, which were comprised of adult females and juveniles, indicating that the social structure of elephants dates back at least 20 million years. The mastodon was around the same weight as the woolly mammoth, but had a shorter, stockier build, with the larger males reaching 2.5 meters at the shoulder. Now, you might think it's weird that two species of elephants could live in the same habitat, because intuition would state that there would be intense competition for resources. The answer to this riddle lies in their teeth. Instead of having many small ridges like mammoths, mastodons had large conical protrusions on their molars. These would have been ideally suited to pulverizing leafy plant matter versus grinding grasses. So, the two species of North American elephants avoided competition via sympatric niche partitioning. The mammoths grazed while the mastodons browsed. The American mastodon died out around 11,000 years ago, along with most other North American Pleistocene megafauna. In South America, a different variety of elephant known as the gomphotheres filled the supersized herbivore niche. Going back to the elephant family tree, gomphotheres branched off before the common ancestor of all living elephants lived, although they diverged from their lineage after the mastodons did. When most paleontology enthusiasts think of a gomphothere, they will usually imagine the shovel tuskers, elephants with upper and lower tusks. However, both species of gomphotheres which survived into the late Pleistocene, that being Nodiomastodon platensis and Quiveronius hyodon, only had two tusks coming out of their cranium like modern elephants. Nodiomastodon was by far the most abundant of the two at the time, with its range extending all across South America except for the north-northeastern part, the high Andes, and Patagonia. Although it lacked the iconic shovel tusks of earlier gomphotheres, Nodiomastodon had a more elongate skull and more forward-facing tusks than modern elephants. It was close to the size of the Asian elephant, with larger males being 2.3 meters at the shoulder and weighing between 3 and 4.5 tons. Whereas mammoths and the mastodon were were specialized in grazing and browsing respectively, Nodiomastodon appears to have a more mixed diet, with bunodont teeth that could both pulverize and grind. It appears to have mostly died out by 11,000 years ago. However, some remains in Colombia have been dated to 6,000 years ago. The other Gomphothere, Quaveronius or Quaver's Gomphothere, had a similar diet and morphology, but with longer tusks. It and Nodiomastodon seem to have partitioned habitats by altitude, with Nodiomastodon inhabiting lowlands, while Quaveronius lived in highlands, residing mostly in the Andes and the high mountains of Mexico. Quaveronius was extirpated from South America by 44,000 years ago, long before humans arrived on the continent. However, in Mexico, the youngest Quaveronius remains were found in the Sonora and were dated to 13,000 years ago. Furthermore, this was a kill site, indicating that Paleo-Indians did indeed encounter this species. Given the tropical and subtropical distribution of late Pleistocene Gomphotheres, it's likely that they were mostly hairless. Going back to the Eastern Hemisphere, the next group of ancient elephants we'll look at are the Stegodons. Going back to our phylogeny, the Stegodons again branched off from modern elephants before the common ancestor of all the living ones existed, but they were closer to them than the Gomphotheres and Mastodon. The most striking feature of the Stegodons was how close their tusks were together, all the while being quite large. This meant they either had to use their trunks off to the side, or their trunks were very narrow. Like modern elephants and mammoths, they had lamellae or ridges on their molars. By the late Pleistocene, the Stegodons resided in southern and eastern Asia, with at least 2 and at most 4 species encountered by modern humans. The first 2 are Stegodon ganesa in India and Stegodon orientalis in China. Stegodon ganesa was about the size of an African bush elephant, while Stegodon orientalis was closer in size to the Asian elephant, with both having similar bodily proportions. Ganesa died out between 30 and 35,000 years ago, while orientalis went extinct 12,000 years ago. Holocene remains of S. orientalis have been purported, but could not be reliably dated. These 2 species cohabited with the Asian elephant, and many paleontologists pondered why it survived while the Stegodons didn't. The most likely explanation is that the Asian elephant was more of a generalist feeder, while the Indian and Chinese Stegodons were specialized to browse in dense forests. They would have shared this habitat with the iconic giant ape Gigantopithecus. Further south, Stegodon trigonocephalus lived in Java. This species was also close to the same size as the modern Asian elephant and has been cited as an example of island dwarfism. This designation is questionable because while it was descended from the larger Stegodon huanenensis, which was close to the same size as the African bush elephant, Stegodon orientalis shrunk by a similar degree, yet it lived on the mainland. So, the decrease in size seen in Stegodon trigonocephalus could be seen as part of a quote-unquote normal pattern of size change over time. Furthermore, Java is only an island during the interglacial periods. During the ice ages when the sea levels are lower, it's part of the Sundaland Peninsula. While Stegodon ganesa and orientalis were primarily browsers, Stegodon trigonocephalus appears to have been a grazer. So, while the Stegodon clade as a whole had a varied diet, the individual species had specialized ones. Stegodon trigonocephalus died out between 130,000 and 80,000 years ago, and this is believed to have been caused by the climate of Java becoming wetter. This would have resulted in forests displacing the grasslands, which Trigonocephalus depended on for feeding. The oldest modern human remains in the region date to 73,000 years ago, so it's possible that the first people migrated to Java a few thousand years earlier. If this is the case, humans could have encountered the Javan stegodon, but even then, we're assuming the most recent possible extinction date. The last species of stegodon we'll look at is Stegodon florensis. As its name suggests, it was endemic to the island of Flores. This species was one of many elephants who underwent island dwarfism, with late Pleistocene individuals being around 1.3 meters at the shoulder and weighing up to 570 kilos. It would have shared its habitat with the peculiar dwarf hominin Homo floresiensis. Stegodon florensis died out 50,000 years ago, and this seems to have coincided with a large volcanic eruption that also wiped out many other large animals endemic to Flores, including the dwarf humans. Another species of Stegodon, Stegodon sundari, also landed on Flores in the early Pleistocene, and underwent island dwarfism and was wiped out by a volcanic eruption. So, it seems volcanoes are a recurring cause of extinction in southern Indonesia. The oldest modern human remains from Flores date to 46,000 years ago, but with the recent discovery of the oldest cave art from Sulawesi, we know modern humans reached this far east by 51,000 years ago, adding credibility to the possibility that they witnessed the odd flora of Flores, including the pygmy elephants. Last, but certainly not least, we have the straight-tusked elephants, or Paleoloxodon. These include some of, if not the, largest proboscideans of all time and possibly the largest terrestrial land mammals. If we look at the elephant family tree, their position on it isn't as clear as the other major groups. Initially, Paleoloxodon was classed as a subgroup of the genus Elephas, which includes the Asian elephant, but in the early 20th century, it was argued that it should be instead grouped with African elephants. And to clarify, there are two species of African elephants, the larger bush elephant and the smaller forest elephant. In the latter part of the 20th century, Paleoloxodon was put at the base of the Asian elephant branch of the family tree, having split off before the mammoths and modern Asian elephant diverged. A 2016 study of their mitochondrial DNA indicated that the forest elephant and Paleoloxodon were sister groups, which would have made the genus Loxodonta invalid. The scientific name of the forest elephant is Loxodonta cyclotis, and that of the bush elephant is Loxodonta africana. An analysis of the nuclear genome of Paleoloxodon revealed a more complicated evolutionary history. Initially, it split off at the base of the African branch of the elephant family tree, but then interbred with a progenitor of the mammoths before interbreeding with the ancestors of the forest elephant. This would have given them a mixture of features characteristic of both the African and Asian elephants, which can explain why there was so much disagreement as to how to classify them based on their morphology alone. It's also a good example of how the branching tree pattern is inadequate to describe the evolutionary history of a group, and instead, you have to use a glacial runoff model, where streams branch off but can sometimes reconnect later. The first species encountered by modern humans would have been Paleoloxodon jolensis, which lived in Africa until about 130,000 years ago. Although I should note that there is some disagreement as to whether or not P. jolensis is a distinct species, or a continuation of Paleoloxodon reckii, the first member of this genus. Humans first evolved in northwestern Africa 300,000 years ago, and by 153,000 years ago, they spread all the way to South Africa, meaning they would have cohabited with P. jolensis for tens of thousands of years. Not much is known about the size and morphology of Paleoloxodon jolensis, because it's only known from a few molars. But from these, we know it was primarily a grazer, based on the wear patterns on the teeth. Further north in Europe, we find Paleoloxodon antiquus, whose range expanded and shrunk between ice ages and interglacials, at times reaching as far north as the Urals. Like the Columbian mammoth, it is often depicted as being mostly hairless, and again, I think this is so people don't confuse it with a woolly mammoth, or any mammoth for that matter. But again, like the Columbian mammoth, Paleoloxodon antiquus would have been exposed to freezing temperatures regularly, so they probably had a fur coat a few centimeters long. Paleoloxodon antiquus was 2.5 times the size of the African bush elephant, with large males weighing in at 15 tons and standing 4.2 meters at the shoulder. It had large occipital crests on the top of its skull to anchor powerful neck muscles. Unlike jolensis, Paleoloxodon antiquus was a mixed feeder. By the time modern humans reached Europe, it had vanished from most of its range, but clung on the Iberian Peninsula until 28,000 years ago. While we have evidence of Homo sapiens in Iberia before this time, and interactions between Neanderthals and Paleoloxodon antiquus, we have yet to find any evidence of direct Homo sapien Paleoloxodon antiquus interactions. However, the 28,000-year estimate is based on footprints, and the youngest bones we have of P. antiquus are 43,000 years old, while the oldest human remains on the Iberian Peninsula date to 35,000 years ago, so perhaps the two never met. In India, we find Paleoloxodon pneumaticus, and this was arguably the largest proboscidean who ever lived. The remains we have are more fragmentary than those of P. antiquus, so it's hard to get a good weight estimate. But from these, we know bulls frequently reached 4.5 meters at the shoulder, making them even larger than the already enormous P. antiquus, which is neck and neck with the largest mammoths and dinotheres in size. A few years ago, it broke headlines when it was claimed to be the largest land mammal who ever lived, even surpassing Paraceratherium. This was based on a portion of a femur found in the 19th century that has since been lost, which gave an estimated shoulder height of 5 meters and a weight of 24 tons. Prior developments in the field of paleontology gave researchers good reasons to be skeptical. In 1878, Edward Drinker Cope found an enormous dinosaur vertebrae, which he thought belonged to a diplodocid, and based on its size, he gave an estimate of 120 tons for the dinosaur, which he named M. fossilius fragimilis. But the fossil was lost, and all he had was his drawings, so no one could properly reanalyze the specimen to verify the claims. But in 2018, an analysis of the depictions indicated that M. fossilius was a rhybachosauride, not a diplodocid. Since rhybachosaurids had proportionally much larger vertebrae than diplodocids, giving a size estimate for Cope's specimen based on them wouldn't put it among the largest dinosaurs, let alone the largest as had long been speculated. So, when a claim of something being the largest land mammal is based on a lost bone, we should take it with a healthy heap of salt. But if you look at the publication that gave the upper size estimate, it includes size estimates for various individual prehistoric elephants. Among these is a subadult P. pneumaticus, which was similar in size to the largest P. antiquus. So, weights of fully grown bulls in excess of 20 tons is supported by more than a lost femur. Paleoloxodon pneumaticus seems to have been primarily a grazer, so, in ancient India, there would have been a peculiar form of niche partitioning. You would have had Stegodon ganesa browsing and Paleoloxodon pneumaticus grazing, while the Asian elephant somehow managed to slip between the two as a generalist feeder. Paleoloxodon pneumaticus also had the signature occipital crests of P. antiquus, but these were even larger and more folded downward. This enormous animal died out between 50,000 and 25,000 years ago, and the oldest Homo sapien remains in India date to 80,000 years ago, although some dispute this dating. But the presence of Homo sapiens in Indonesia from 70,000 years ago indicate that humans had certainly reached India by 50,000 years ago, i.e., they would have cohabited with P. pneumaticus. Further east in China, we have Paleoloxodon huaihonensis, which is about the same size as P. antiquus, and its extinction date is poorly resolved. While the continental straight-tusked elephants were absolutely enormous, various forms underwent island dwarfism. In Sicily and Malta, we have P. nigeriensis. This species was between 1.8 and 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed between 1.1 and 1.7 tons. The oldest human remains in Sicily date to 13,500 years ago, although there was a land bridge 21,000 years ago between the island and the Italian mainland, which humans could have crossed. So, like the Sardinian dwarf mammoth, it's a possibility that Homo sapiens encountered P. nigeriensis, but it's far from a certainty. The other late Pleistocene island Paleoloxodon is P. cyproides, which, as its name suggests, lived on Cyprus. This was even smaller than P. menidriensis, being 1 meter tall at the shoulder and weighing 200 kilograms. Their skeletal features are quite neotenous, so they would have looked like cute elephant calves even into adulthood. The Cyprus and Sicilian dwarf elephants both evolved from Paleoloxodon antiquus. P. cyproides was the last of the straight-tusked elephants, having died out between 11,500 and 12,000 years ago. This was shortly after humans arrived on the island, which led many to argue that overhunting by humans led to its extinction. However, there is very little evidence of humans hunting, let alone overhunting P. cyproides. The type specimen was found in a bone bed which included the Cyprus dwarf hippopotamus that was initially believed to be human refuse, but other means of remain assemblage at the site haven't been ruled out yet. Although it should be noted that hunting them isn't the only way humans can drive an animal to extinction. The first people in Cyprus came from the Levant, where the Neolithic or agricultural revolution began near the end of the Pleistocene. So, when humans arrived on Cyprus, they would have cleared land to grow crops, which would have restricted the habitat of the Cyprus dwarf elephants, which in turn could have led to their downfall. The last island dwarf straight-tusked elephant we'll look at is Paleoloxodon nomani, which lived in Japan. While it was smaller than the mainland species, it was still quite large, standing 2.5 meters at the shoulder and weighing 4 tons, which made it comparable to the modern Asian elephant. The temperatures it would have been exposed to would be in between those experienced by the woolly mammoth and P. antiquus, making it a virtual certainty that it was covered in thick fur for insulation. Wear patterns on the molars indicate it was a browser and would have eaten coarser foods than continental straight-tusked elephants, like conifer needles and twigs. Of all the Paleoloxodon species, P. nomani is the only one we have undisputed evidence of direct interactions with humans, such as bones found with stone tools with clear signs of butchering. Humans first arrived on the Japanese archipelago 40,000 years ago, while P. nomani died out 24,000 years ago, meaning the two cohabited for 16,000 years. The extinction date of P. nomani coincides with the glacial maximum of the last ice age. This is also the case for most other late Pleistocene straight-tusked elephants, indicating that climate change was largely responsible for the extinction of these magnificent beasts. While the woolly mammoth usually is the first thing to come to mind when we think of prehistoric giants our distant ancestors encountered, they bore witness to a diverse array of prehistoric elephants, many as impressive in their own right. It's crazy to think that just 100,000 years ago, there were several times as many elephants as there are today, covering all corners of the globe except Australia and Antarctica. Although it may be disappointing that most of these are now gone, I think it's all the more reason to cherish and preserve the 3 species who remain. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I hope to make similar videos about prehistoric carnivorans, ungulates, xenarthans, marsupials, and reptiles that ancient humans encountered. Thanks.